Okay, let's keep going with downsides that you see of each methodology. One of you guys want to?
Well, it's a bit of a rebuttal, but it's sort of.
Go on to the new point, though, if you would.
And I've got a downside of Scrum I haven't talked about yet.
And I'm just going to talk about downside of Scrum. It's like I'm not going to rebut the Kanban piece, although I will do that later. Yeah, we asked to have Scrum Masters on our teams, and one Scrum Master.
On the Kanban teams?
No, on our Scrum teams.
Okay, yeah.
And we asked that there be one Scrum Master per Scrum team. I can tell you that there's no organization I've been a part of, nor coached, that had one Scrum Master per one team.
Right.
They're always divided, or they don't have Scrum Masters, or they rotate Scrum Masters. That role is not really valued, right? So what I've seen.
But here's the thing.
Let me finish this.
It's not required in Scrum.
Let him make his point.
I'm going to let him make my point. So the reality is, and you actually talked about this before. One of the weaknesses of Scrum is, I can draw the Scrum machine, the Scrum Snowman, the 3 roles, 3 ceremonies, 3 artifacts. It's great. I can do that in 5 minutes, and it's awesome. And you absolutely can implement that. Right, and most people don't spend the time to understand why you're doing those things, and they do all the whats, right? And it looks like it's kind of that cargo cult Agile that we talk about.
It's like what we're talking about.
But a lot of those teams, or some of those teams that I've seen, are doing Agile for Agile's sake, or doing Scrum for Scrum's sake, and they're not looking at business value. They're not looking at business metrics to say we actually are getting better business results from using Scrum. Some of them are either dogmatic and say we're better at Agile, right? But it doesn't serve the business.
Not necessarily.
Necessarily.
Rod, are you saying that this is a defect of both, that people aren't necessarily actually doing?
It's actually kind of a rebuttal there, because with Scrum I've seen it more often. With Kanban, and I think it's because of some of that focus on the managers, they actually do have to have business results out of their organizations.
True.
And so for them, getting those metrics and getting that data, that empirical data around Kanban helps them manage better to get better business results. Right? There's a little bit different of a focus there. Now, I'm not saying that when I coach Scrum, I don't actually want to get them towards better business results. I absolutely do. But that's not in sort of the Scrum framework, and they don't talk about that specifically. Or people don't understand it enough to
delivering
to
increments with value is not part of Scrum?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, okay.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. But a lot of teams focus on where we're going to deliver incrementally. Okay. Right? And they miss why they're doing it, right?
Okay. So we have a role in Scrum called the product owner.
Yep.
And that's sort of that person's role. And just the previous comment about the Scrum Master thing is there's nothing in Scrum that requires that you have one full-time person that's the Scrum Master. It is a role, not a job title, not a job position, right? And so you could, potentially be a Scrum Master for multiple teams, and sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not okay, depending on the Scrum maturity of the teams and the Scrum Master. So the product owner role, though, exclusively focuses on business value. And I've noticed that in Kanban, I have a hard time seeing, where that focus comes from. Is that from the managers again, because they're trying to reap the business value results? Is that
not necessarily?
The team's obviously focused on it too, but I don't know. There's not a specific role in Kanban for that, but there is in Scrum. So I've been talking a lot, so I'll get off the wagon for a minute.
I guess my only rebuttal there is I guess I can see the same things happening with Kanban teams too, right? They say, oh yeah, we're visualizing our work, we're limiting width, we're measuring things, but also not understanding the why, right?
Yep.
So,
absolutely.
I think that can happen regardless of what
absolutely
method or framework or process you're choosing to follow, which is unfortunate. And I do definitely see it too often.
If I can tag on that, that's why one of the myths that we discussed at the leadership retreat in San Diego is, I've seen Kanban. It's Scrum without iterations, or it's Scrum without estimating. And that's exactly why, Brad, because these people are applying quote-unquote Kanban without understanding the why. And that's exactly what people like myself and Todd go out and try to do is, no, don't focus on the practice that you're observing. Focus on why they changed and what metric did they use to validate that they were going to make that change, or indicate they were going to make that change. So I find it's kind of surprising because I agree. It requires more discipline. And to Charles's point, I agree. The Kanban method is probably more for, as I said, a change management system, and it's probably more for managers or management-like people or management-minded people. So far, I agree with both of what you guys have said about Kanban accurately, I think. Is it my turn to give where I think it fails? Okay.
Sure, you're doing fine.
All right. So what I'd like to say where I think it fails and where it doesn't fit well, there's actually several, but I'll give you one. And I think this is a key part of understanding the Kanban method. when I see it really struggle is when people apply the Kanban method and they look at the properties and they do them just like we're asking them to do, but their mindset is still stuck in that deterministic, predictive mindset, and so they still overlay their estimating techniques and practices that they've learned right on top of the Kanban method. And I think that's when I don't see it well, when not only do they do the practices, but they don't change their mindset, and they still are stuck in the deterministic mindset and don't move to the more probabilistic mindset, where I think Kanban really excels. And then I think you start to see the improvements.
So I'm inclined to turn it over to the audience to ask questions. Okay. So who's got a question for, preferably for multiple people on the panel?
Why do they call it a Scrum Master?
Because Ken Schwaber came up with that name. I don't know.
I can add a little more to that. The intent of it was it's supposed to be the master of the Scrum. Okay, so remember, Scrum is based on the rugby metaphor of 10 guys. I think women play rugby too, but 10 people playing rugby, all kind of interlinked, moving the ball down the field together. So it was intended to be the master of the Scrum. The other reason is that he was adamantly against calling that role the project manager for obvious reasons, that it comes with a bunch of traditional baggage. So.
Yeah, I think more generally, I think there's very intentional, I think the founders were very intentional about changing the language, because language is a very important part of how we think about concepts. And if we just borrowed old concepts and people said, oh, here's this new thing, and they have a project manager as part of that. We have project managers, so okay, well, it must be the same thing. So
right.
Changing the names forces us to stop and say, well, what is this? What is a sprint? What is a Scrum Master? What is a daily Scrum? What is a product owner, not a product manager? So I now have to ask about why are these different than my traditional terms.
So I wish Kanban would have a similar role, and they could be the Flow Meister. What do you think? Because Flow Master is like a toilet or something, and I don't want to do that. But Flow Meister is like cool. It's like a DJ or something.
Ken has also been heard to say that he didn't think anybody would want to put Scrum Master on their business card or brag about being one. So he thought that would be, sufficiently servant leader-like.
Yep.
So what do you see for the project managers? What kind of roles do you see them in your implementations?
So in Kanban, project managers remain.
Repeat the question.
Oh, yeah. So the question is, what do you see the role of project manager being in our respective areas, right? And so in Kanban, they remain a project manager. We're going to visualize our workflow as we do it currently. We respect their title and their role. That's the rebuttal to we have a product owner doing value. We actually have product managers, project managers, plenty of titles and roles and responsibilities that people already have. In Kanban, we just map how that's flowing across our system. Are we doing well with it? Where are our bottlenecks? How do we improve it? And we just go from there, right? So we don't actually switch people up in Kanban, right? I can answer the Scrum thing too, but you guys go ahead.
What do you do with the
Go ahead. Go ahead. Or I'll go.
So, I mean, what do most organizations do, or what should they do?
No, in your implementations, where do you place the project?
What do you do, Brad?
Yeah, what do you do? Or,
So what I like to do is I like to look at the responsibilities that Scrum ascribes to Scrum Masters, product owners, team members, and then within an organization say, well, tell me, what do your project managers do today? How does that map to Scrum's definition of these roles? I like to look at individuals as people that have their own kind of special personalities and strengths and weaknesses. So I may say in general within an organization, maybe project manager role maps more closely to a product owner role. Most organizations don't even consider that. They just immediately say project managers, you're now Scrum Masters. Oftentimes it maps actually better to product owner. But I like to look at individuals, right? Because one individual might say, I kind of gravitate towards that product owner role. I like that focus on the product and focus on business value. Others might say, hey, I'm really jazzed and passionate about this process and achieving improvement within the team. So that person might be a better fit in a Scrum Master role. So I like to look at the people involved. Speaking of respecting the people, that's part of respecting the people is not treating them as automatons and saying that if your title is X, you must do this.
so does that mean that you actually do away with the project manager role? Because someone has been trained for 40 years as a project manager. Suddenly you say, you need to become a servant leader or you need to start working? As
Well, they may already
product
be a
owner?
servant leader. Maybe.
No, there's no two ways about it, but you have.
Is there?
You have a career path now, which is fantastic when you're 40 years old. You should go as a product owner, or you should be going as a Scrum Master.
Right.
Is that how you do your implementations, where you actually change? What happens to the portfolio manager on top of the project manager? What do you do with them? Do they make them product owners, or do you make them Scrum Masters?
I don't force them to go into any one of the roles, and I always have this conversation usually early on, so I know kind of what we're up against. But if they are already a servant leader, because this is where I sort of differ with you a little bit, then the servant leader type project managers that I've coached are awesome Scrum Masters, right? And then there's some that I've coached that can't let go of the command and control ways of being a project manager, and they are horrible Scrum Masters. So in that sense, what I would look to do is Scrum Master, product owner, even go back and be a senior developer. You know, I think one of the things that we've got away from in the industry is providing a technical track for very senior people. And there's some companies out there that are doing some really cool stuff along these lines. So any one of those is good. Portfolio manager, typically a portfolio manager, are you talking about like a business kind of portfolio manager, or like more like a sort of project manager of project managers? I mean, what are you talking about when you say that?
I think that's really specific. I'd kind of like to.
Okay.
If you all,
Well, he was asking about that role, that kind of role.
Several
Yeah.
people. Oh, sorry, you got another question. We got other questions bottled up, I think.
That's fine.
I won't take any more time. If somebody wants to talk to me about that project manager question, though, I have a great story that I'd like to share with you offline, but because we're moving on. But
Yeah.
I'd really like to share with, if anybody's interested in what I think of project manager and where they fit, and I'll share that through a story.
I was got a question, yeah.
So Scrum uses the word velocity and Kanban uses the word throughput.
Yep.
What's velocity, what's throughput? Why are they different?
Actually, I don't think the word velocity is in the Scrum guide anymore.
What's
So
the new word?
there isn't a new word for it, really. It's described vaguely as the team's ability to produce, and in terms of knowing what they can do for the next sprint, like their capability of what they could possibly do the next sprint. Velocity is just one way of handling that sort of planning feature.
It used to mean.
Okay, what did it used to mean?
It meant the total points of the stories that you got done in that duration.
I was looking.
Well, yeah,
I was cutting to the chase.
yeah. I know it's hard to answer in a short time frame, but the gist of it is, the purpose of it was to help, and it's a user story practice, so it's still a practice in user stories, but not necessarily Scrum. You can do it in Scrum. So now that I got that confusing bit out of the way, it was used as a planning tool to know roughly how much you can take on the next sprint, roughly when the neget release will go out. That was the intended use of it. It got abused a fair amount.
Sounds like throughput.
Well, maybe you guys could tell us how throughput and velocity are different then, because I know y'all know about velocity.
Well, I'll tell you what I think throughput is first of all, and then go from there. So throughput is a rate essentially of, am I talking a rate of the number of work items completed or that processes through the system over a period of time, a defined period of time. So in most cases, sometimes you'll report throughput, number of stories per day, number of stories per week, that kind of thing, depending on what rate makes sense in your context. So essentially, it's a measure of number of work items going through from the beginning to the end of your workflow, and you define that, those starting points and those end points, over a period of time of interest.
So it sounds like the same concept.
There's only one.
Yeah.
There is
Well-
one minor difference, though, right? Because
Well-
doesn't Kanban do it kind of like tracking actual time, whereas Scrums is more of a generic, like roughly, it's a historical record that you use. I mean, you track actual time for throughput, right?
So
How many days it was in progress?
Well, no,
or
that's
whatever.
cycle and lead time.
Okay,
That's
okay.
that's a different measure. But yeah, throughput and velocity are very close. I mean, the way that I've seen it different between a Scrum team and a Kanban team is normally a Scrum team will use story points, and velocity for them is equal to the number of story points over the course of their sprint, whether that's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever that time frame is. In Kanban teams, some of them still use story points. They'll actually use some of the Scrum techniques to do this, and some will use it as a number of work items, so number of defects plus number of or just things that we do. I mean, the count of stories versus having an abstracted point system on top of that. That said, with the teams that I coach, let's start off one way. Let's see if that works for us. If we need to change that, we'll evolve that practice.
Brad, did you have
No, yeah, I mean, I think they're basically trying to get at the same concept.
Yeah.
Just slightly different ways of measuring them.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, so most of us live in a financially constrained world. We spend
Yep.
a good part of the first part of our year doing budgets and forecasts. And it's always a contentious area for me when it comes to Agile, because the business doesn't want to hear 2 months into the year that we're behind schedule, we got to start cutting features out down the road. And plus, we got marketing initiatives and things that go out far in advance of the product. And so, does either methodology help with that?
I would say, I was just going to say that the old way is we tell them at the end of the year
Right.
that we're going to be late.
Yeah, exactly. And
It's like 5 minutes before it's due.
Right.
We're late.
And both methods will give you that visibility in different ways, but they'll both tell you about 2 months in, you know what, we're not going to make this.
So you might have just saved 10 months worth of money.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly
Business
the goal.
doesn't like saving 10 months worth of
Yeah, I think the
payroll.
goal, I won't speak for Kanban or Scrum here specifically. I think the goal behind Agile Lean Principles is let's discover things earlier rather than later, and let's try to have some real data to base that on, whether it's my velocity in story points is lower than we projected and therefore we need to cut scope, or my throughput is lower in items per month and therefore we need to have a discussion around scope. I understand that business people don't like to hear that, but it's reality, and if I have data to back it up, they can say they don't like it and they can pound their fist on the table and they can say that's not good enough, but the reality is at that point we need to have a discussion about what we're going to do. And I think any good project manager at this point will know there's only so many options here. There's scope, there's time, and there's cost, really, unless you're going to sacrifice quality, which I hope you're not going to.
Which don't do.
This gentleman and then back there.
Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing the two different sides, the pros and cons of having fixed iterations versus iterationless.
Great question. So why don't I start, because I've been sitting here quietly wanting to get in. So first of all, the Kanban method doesn't say don't use iterations. It doesn't say use iterations. And let's first of all get on the same page with iterations, because I think what you're really asking is the fixed part. Okay. So neither method, or at least I shouldn't speak for their method, but the Kanban method obviously encourages you to optimize flow of value. In other words, not just number of stories, but stories that are actually producible and of value to the customer. And an iterative way of working definitely supports delivering value faster because you learn more and you can adapt more quickly. I think what you're asking is the fixed question, and that's what I call a time box, a fixed time box. And that's another aspect that Kanban method doesn't say you can't use a fixed time box. The big thing that I think Kanban encourages you to look at is decoupling all the various cadences of the different activities so that you're synchronizing them all at the same time. So one thing for sure that I learned right off the bat applying the Kanban method is I don't have to deploy at the same time that I do my retrospective, that I do my next sprint planning, so to speak. You see what I'm saying? And so you can have quote-unquote fixed iterations in Kanban. The big key is decouple them first, and then you'll start to see now you can also even loosen the boundaries a little bit from iteration to iteration. I hope that helps.
The question was more relationship about planning in general. How do you tell these people that, yes, either of these processes is going to work for your product development or in the second scenario, in your maintenance processes on your application as you're going forward? How do you justify when you value an organization using either of those?
Nothing with the question.
Question makes sense?
Not yet.
So I guess, well, I think what I heard is how do you justify to business people either Kanban or Scrum in terms of how they provide value to the organization?
Two scenarios, either product development, brand new, greenfield development, and sustaining maintenance of a current application just moving forward. Those are the most common scenarios in the business world today. It's like people developing greenfield development and there's existing products. Assume that they don't have that. Which one would you recommend, and then how would you go about justifying?
This might sound like not a good answer, but as a coach and a consultant, I don't say I have enough information about that scenario to say, oh yes, you should do this. And I would challenge anyone who heard that short description of that problem and said, oh yes, this is the answer, this is your answer.
So what would be like a few indicators that would push you this way or a few that would push you the other way?
Well, it's probably not all that shocking, but oftentimes in a support situation or maintenance kind of a situation where the work is not as predictable, it can't necessarily be planned out. You have more emergent things. I think more of a flow-based process does make sense, because it's hard for me to say in maintenance mode, let's plan out the bugs we're going to work on for the next 2 weeks. Now, if I have a backlog of bugs and I can plan those out, I may want to do that. But if there's other bugs coming in at the same time and that's dominating my workflow, I might not want to be as rigid about planning for a 2-week period. Although, again, as Frank mentioned, even if I'm doing Kanban, I may still want to have a cadence for doing some planning, for doing retrospectives. So that may make sense there. So again, I wouldn't even approach that as an either-or situation. I would want to examine it further and say, well, let's look at principles of both. Would we perhaps want to combine them?
We've got about 10 minutes left. Anybody have something they really want to contribute to this, or we can take another one?
I agree with that. I actually do. Delivering value, right? And was your question more about greenfield development versus, maintenance? Is that?
Yeah, maintenance. It could be maintenance just bug fixes. It could also be talking about enhancement.
He's getting up.
To me, this is what's missing from the Kanban versus Scrum conversation. Okay. Partly because Scrum, applies to a fairly specific situation, and Kanban can be applied to 7 or 8 different situations. And so when we talk about Kanban this and Scrum that, we might be comparing apples to oranges. So let me throw this out there, and you Kanban guys can correct me if I'm wrong. But there are some people that use Kanban at the enterprise level, right?
Absolutely.
To map flow through an organization, and that's useful to them. So I'll K-ent, Kanban at the enterprise level. And then there's support and operations, right? So some people use Kanban for support and operations. Brad, do you have any experience with clients that use Scrum for support and operations?
Yes, I mean, I've had experience with clients that are using Scrum to do things completely outside of software, like developing a catalog, or developing other kinds of products.
Okay, all right. So then there's product development, right? And you could probably use Kanban or Scrum for those. And then there's Kanban for software teams, and this one gets tricky, right? So it's sort of like, are you doing Kanban alone, or are you doing Kanban plus something like Scrum or XP or Crystal or whatever, right? And then there's probably a couple others I didn't even put up there. Can y'all think of any?
Not that I'd use with Kanban.
Not that you would use with Kanban, okay. And so, this one seems really good. There's not a lot at the enterprise level for Scrum yet, although something soon is coming out. But it doesn't solve the same kinds of things that Kanban at the enterprise does. So that's cool. So there's not much up here except for Scrum of Scrums and things like that, but it's a little different. Support and operations, I mean, I think it's pretty rare that people use Scrum just because the nature of the work is very, you mentioned it, the flow of the work is very spontaneous and comes in a lot, and a lot of changing priorities. So, I mean, sometimes, especially if there's a lot of changing priorities, I don't think Scrum's really good for that because it's just too much chaos. Now, I would argue, the chaos is a little bit disheartening, but Kanban can help make that visible quickly. And then Kanban software, again, it gets tricky if you're only using Kanban and you're not adding on one of these other things. And I think that's kind of what you were getting to earlier, Frank, was you were saying Kanban is not a software development process. It is a change management process. So here, you can use Kanban to look in on these things, right, and help change your Scrum implementation, your XP implementation. And that's fine so long as, from a Scrum perspective or an XP perspective, you don't change out of the framework. And even then, it's probably fine. But you're no longer doing Scrum, you're no longer doing XP, whatever. That's fine too, if you have success. So part of that, trying to say Kanban's better for this or Scrum's better for that, you have to go one level deeper on the context to really have a good conversation. So I could go on longer, but I'm not going to.
Just a question, general question back to Kanban. My first experience was as a production manager. We had laminated cards. We were ordering supplies. So that was great, very predictable, until your supplier starts changing dates.
Right.
So can you speak to how a manager in a Kanban situation has to manage a developer who may not have a consistent flow or may not work the same, where people change, people have different issues. How do you manage that?
I think I understand the question. I'll take a shot at it.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Variation in your production.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things I like about the Kanban method as we started to apply it to our software development process right off the bat is we moved away from quote-unquote upfront estimating. And we started really just tracking our metrics on the work items going through the workflow. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have variability that you can actually start to measure in various classes of work items, okay? And so for the developer, we quickly learned that these stories typically take X number of days. And once a story started, as it went through the workflow, started to approach what we called our threshold, we started to respond to it differently. It became a different work item at that time. It became an item, I used to say, that's my item. I was the lead manager, whatever you want to call it. But that's what the developers, that's where we realized this work type is not falling into the normal development process. It's something different. In other words, we had to deal with legal, we had to deal with marketing, we had to deal with dependencies, we had to deal with other things. Something that you may not see in quote-unquote an XP practice for the developer. But that's what we did. Once we started to get those metrics, we knew when a quote-unquote work item was not acting or behaving normal, and we responded and reacted dynamically, differently.
Yeah, and one thing I've done with Kanban teams, I think Kanban doesn't tell you to do teams. Right, but I think Scrum actually was onto something there with a delivery team. Yeah. People are highly variable, even within themselves working. Like when I was a developer, I had some weeks where I was incredibly productive, and some weeks where something was going on with my family, and I was distracted, or I had something else going on, some stress, and I was less productive. Right, there can be wide levels of variability with individual people. But when you have a delivery team, that smooths out a little bit. There's still some variability, but in Kanban we measure that, right? And it goes more towards, like you're saying, probabilistic versus deterministic. So with a team and their cycle times of different categories of work, I can say, my cycle time is a 50-50 shot that I'll get that. But I can look at a chart, based on our metrics and say, I have a 70 or 80% shot at this. Is that okay for you, manager, that, are we 80% certain we can get this at this point?
So you spend a lot of time categorizing the type of work you're doing?
If we need to.
Whereas that might be a sizing bucket on the Scrum side? Or that's how we do it?
That's one way of categorizing work. Another way is it's an emergency versus a defect versus a regular work item, right? So there's different ways to categorize it.
I just want to add real quickly. When I started collecting these metrics, I learned very quickly within quote-unquote 3 sprints, if you will, 6 weeks. I started to map out the shape of the data. I was surprised that over 18 months, the shape of the data was the shape of the data. I mean, if you manage the system and you're disciplined, you can control the shape of the data that you're going to get, with exceptions, of course. But those exceptions, I'm talking, I think 11 out of almost 600 data points didn't fall into something that we quote was expected, that we thought was expected. Yep.
The Kanban process has explicit WIP limits, and one of the effects, especially in the software business, or one of the purposes to which that's sometimes used, is to encourage swarming behavior, to move each item through quicker, rather than get everything started all at once, and then, 8 days into a 10-day sprint, everything's 80% done. Does Scrum have what's the Scrum answer to that? How do you leverage Scrum to affect the team dynamics, perhaps get more collaboration and teamwork going?
To me, this gets back to, again, understanding underlying principles, right? If I'm just doing Scrum mechanics, I can miss out on this, and I can start all 10 of my stories at the same time on day 1 of the sprint. If I understand what we're trying to do, which is also, again, trying to get faster feedback, complete value sooner, then I'm going to limit WIP. And I might then say, hey, there's this Kanban thing, has a whole theory and book of knowledge around limiting work in progress. Why don't I pull that into my Scrum process and apply what other folks have learned within the Scrum process? And to me, a good Scrum team will use WIP limits in addition to the time box that sort of is your upper limit on WIP.
They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah. Maybe a quick clarification would be helpful. My organization right now has a very heavily cowboy culture, where people are used to working independently, I would say even isolatedly. Yeah. Could we compare and contrast the two approaches for the tools they might provide to help mitigate that, increase the bus number?
Before you answer that, I have a flight to catch. So I'm going to ask Mr. Viggio, who's kindly agreed to take over, so I'm not the bottleneck for this process.
Okay. Thanks,
And
Michael.
thank you.
Yeah,
all
thank you,
very
Michael.
much.
Thank you.
They got a
Thank you,
question?
Michael.
So can you restate it one more time?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah, my organization has
Oh.
very heavy cowboy culture.
Right.
How could each of these methods help me mitigate that?
Right.
Increase the bus number, get a
Yeah,
little
so-
more teamwork going.
On the Kanban side, and Scrum does this as well with a different way, and you guys can talk about that. But on the Kanban side, it's really about getting a card across the board and as a team. Again, I'm going to make the assumption we're working as teams because most organizations are doing that now. But we're trying to get that value moved across the board as a team, right? So we see a blockage, and we have to get across to our team that as a team we're responsible for moving this across. So that blockage, that far over in our board, is the most important thing to do right now. So we have to swarm, right? I mean, you even sort of said that in your previous question. That's just the mechanism by which Kanban does this, by visualizing it, seeing a blockage. Now we have to react to that, right? And I know techniques for Scrum, but I want you guys to be able to answer that.
sure, because I'll add, then I'll turn it over. But
Yeah.
again, that's where the discipline to have the metrics tells you that this thing is reaching a point that is not normal here. We need to respond differently, or we risk it exceeding an expected quote-unquote time.
Usually when those kind of things happen, you don't need metrics to show it, right? I mean, and that's one of the beauties of Scrum, in my opinion, is you're going to have a retrospective every 2 weeks. You know, and if you're doing 80% of everything and then all of a sudden nothing's actually done at the end of a sprint, that review that you have with your stakeholders, first of all, is going to expose that you have nothing done because you only demoed done software in Scrum. And then the retrospective is going to give you a chance to talk about why you had nothing to show. And to some degree, the way the Scrum world handles it is we make a joke about it and call it Scrummer Fall. You know, it's at the last day of the sprint, we realize nothing is actually done, you know. So in the same way that they were talking about in terms of making it visible on the board, you know, most Scrum teams have a Scrum board, which makes those kinds of things visible. It makes the guy who's taken off 10 tasks at a time, it makes that visible, and then you have a daily Scrum to talk about that. And while Kanban does encourage you to improve collaboratively, right? Isn't that the phrasing? You know, Scrum mandates that you improve collaboratively at least for a couple hours every 2 weeks. And that's one of my sort of complaints about Kanban, is it just gives this generic thing of, let's improve collaboratively. Well, what job have you ever had where anybody disagreed with that? Yeah, let's improve collaboratively. That sounds good, but unless you have a disciplined approach to that, you know, I think it gets lost. And now, obviously, both methods will encourage you to improve collaboratively all the time, right? Through daily Scrums, daily stand-ups, whatever it is. But Scrum mandates that at least every couple of weeks, it's your job to come out with a plan to do things better.
I guess maybe just a final comment on that. That's one of those cultural aspects, right? If that's baked into the DNA of the culture, you want to ask, you know, do we really want to change that? That could be painful.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, what you want to look at is, well, are we being successful in our cowboy culture? Maybe you are, maybe you're not. You know, maybe by making some of these things visible, that might get some interest in people to act more collaboratively, to try swarming. So.
More questions? We can run past 8 o'clock, so you know, if you have to go, it's okay. But
Maybe poll the audience and see what they're thinking.
yeah, what are you all thinking? We have time for more questions.
Is there a
If you wanna stick around.
burning pain point that somebody has that I'd love to hear burning pain points?
So I'd go into detail about the estimation part of it.
Okay.
Very difficult for us. We have this roadmap out in front of us, and these product owners, business owners want to say, well, about how long do you think it's going to take for this release, and about how long is it going to take for this release? Kanban, what I recall reading and trying to do, really wants your work items to get kind of around the same size so that you can get some kind of predictability. But that takes some planning in itself just to do that, right?
I love this question.
So,
I absolutely love this question.
Right, so it's kind of this, well, we still want to do story points to give an idea of the effort so that we don't have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out every little story that we're going to work on versus Kanban's, we're going to start a release, we're going to try to break everything down, so hopefully it'll go through the board in 2 or 3 days so it becomes more of a, otherwise you get stories that sit on the board for 4 weeks and some that put on the board for 2 weeks or 2 days even.
So let me just make sure I heard the question. The core of the question is, does Kanban need you to have stories planned the same size? Or did I miss the question?
Well, that was part of it.
That's
By
part
the
of it.
time you get to that release level,
Okay.
but just the overall idea of getting that deliverable.
In order to hit a release,
Yeah.
you think, okay. I like this question because I do hear it a lot. I'm sure you hear it a lot too.
Oh, yeah.
And the first thing I say is Kanban does not require you to have the stories the same size or even extremely similar size. Okay, let's just, I don't know where the variation is before you say it's not the same size. It does probably demonstrate the benefit of having stories the same size, but it doesn't require it. And so I come back to, I'm going to come back to the metrics again, if you haven't gotten that pattern here yet. Once you know what's expected for what I call a typical story, and you don't give a point estimate, you give a range estimate. So you might say it's going to be from 2 to 7 days, for example. 70% of the stories take 2 to 7 days. Okay. So what we did is we actually did very little planning up front. We went from doing, and I'm not saying this was a Scrum team's fault or anything like that. I'm just saying this is the result of why we went to more of a pull method. We were spending approximately 2 days of our quote-unquote 10-day sprint trying to figure out how to size stories, and we stopped doing that, okay? And we simply just started measuring the stories. And once we started measuring the stories and getting an idea of what's expected, we knew dynamically, as the story started working on it, we knew then we just start breaking it down. So we break it down dynamically. After a few sprints, we finally we were quickly able to determine how many stories we typically get for an MMF, for example. Once we had this data, we were able to predict quote-unquote releases.
So you dynamically start chunking that stuff down to smaller
After you
stories
have some
as you
information that indicates where you should start breaking it down. And that's what we call just-in-time planning. And so Kanban method is very, very much a just-in-time type process.
So how did you deal with that idea that, hey, we have a release, here are the 3 feature sets we want to
Yeah,
do?
so
about how long do you think that's going to take?
So we broke down our quote-unquote pieces of work into MMFs, that's what we called them, and we quickly found out how many stories we should expect for an MMF, and we quickly found out over time how much expected time it took for an MMF. Now, when management started to ask us, how long is it going to take to do these 3 MMFs, we had data. We had data we could point to, and we could say, here's the 50% mark, here's the 80% mark. Okay.
Yeah,
So I know Charles laughed at that statement, but there are a lot of Scrum teams that spend a lot of time doing estimating.
And they need my help. Because there's no way you should spend 20% of a sprint planning.
There's no way.
No, I said there's no way you should spend 20% of your sprint planning for the other 8 days minus a day for review and so now it's 2 days to plan for 7. That's ridiculous. But if any of you are in one of those companies, call me. I will help you fix that problem. Okay.
But to be fair, Charles, to get to your point, that's the kind of quote-unquote predictability you were probably being asked to produce, I would guess, and that's why people kept spending so much time planning.
Yeah. Again, they would need my help for that. So one thing I want to mention about the just-in-time planning, just real quick, about 1.5 years ago, the Scrum Guide changed to allow for more adaptive planning inside the sprint. So this is something not a lot of people know. So you don't necessarily have to plan 2 weeks of work out at the sprint planning meeting. You can just plan for the first few days and then adapt it in line. So that's something that, again, not a lot of people know, but it's definitely out there. And obviously Scrum handles that I'll let you talk about how Scrum handles the predictability thing.
Yeah, I mean, getting back to it again, to me it's about having real data. I can get real data from a Scrum team in terms of velocity, and I can use that, and I have used that very successfully to be able to answer that question, which management is always going to be asking, which is how long is it going to take? They're never going to stop asking that question, and we need to have some kind of an answer. I completely agree with Frank that we should stop giving that answer in terms of this is how long it should take. We should give that answer in terms of a range. And if I've got data to back that up, obviously I'm in a much stronger position to make that. So collect the data, give your estimates and ranges. Don't spend 2 days estimating stuff. I can estimate a backlog with a team in a matter of minutes, getting to a simple way of estimating it. It gives us good enough information to say, yep, we can plan for that. It's accurate enough that we can, and again, with some history and velocity, that we can have confidence in that metric.
Did you ask for a team commitment on how much time they know it's going to take to do it? Individual developers and that, because some guys know they can knock out 4 stories in 2 days, not a complaint. Others are going to struggle on what they're working on for 3 days. To get it right, get it in the right place, and the right fit.
I guess, getting back to estimating, to me, the estimate we end up with is kind of a nice side effect of the fact that we have to have a nice conversation with the team that helps us achieve shared understanding for what it is we've got to build. So having that conversation to me is useful for the team so that everybody knows what we're going to build. And it's not, like, again, it's nice that we get an estimate at the end of that. But yeah, I like to have the whole team involved in that conversation, not for the purpose just of the estimate, but so that we have shared understanding around it. And because I think you can hopefully get better estimates that way, or if I'm getting multiple perspectives from someone who's maybe new, maybe someone who's a tester versus a programmer versus an analyst. Those multiple viewpoints can, I think, give a better estimate than one person could give.
But your question was
commitment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question was about commitment. And,
commitment, yes.
Right, and what I've seen with the Kanban teams I've had that have started to get really good metrics around how they're building software or other types of work, they're pretty predictable. And then if they've, even at a feature level, if you just categorize based on T-shirt size, right? We actually did this at Rally. Small, medium, large, maybe an extra large for stuff that's, just forget about it this year or in a certain amount of time. You'll start to get metrics on those categories of work, and I can say, my cycle time on a small is, say, 10 days and plus or minus 5 days to get to 90%. Right? So there's actually, the team doesn't even have to look at that other than say, this is a small or medium or large type feature. And the business can actually look at the metrics and the data and say, okay, team doesn't have to make a commitment. They can just say, based on the data, 90% of the time we get these things done within 20, 30 days for, say, a medium, or maybe 40 days for a large, or something along those lines. I'm not using actual numbers that we had, but just to give you an example, kind of a straw man of what those numbers would look like. Where Scrum, on a sprint or a release level, there's certain levels of commitment that you need to have. But
yeah, I mean, in terms of committing, and your question was phrased kind of like, somebody who's like, I need a commitment so you'll know when it gets done, and of course neither method is going to provide that for you, so much so that Scrum changed a couple of years ago to no longer commit to what they're going to do in 2 weeks, but to forecast what they're going to have done in 2 weeks. But I think that the nature of your question, though, is down to, can you give me some predictability about when you're going to deliver? Is that really the nature of your question?
Yeah, and that's an issue that many management people...
Absolutely, and there's nothing wrong with that question.
Because if you forecast 1,000 hours,
right,
then you come back and say,
right,
oh, it's going to take 3,000.
Right, exactly. Right.
Why are we wasting our time?
Right. Could totally agree, and you can figure that out very quickly.
I got to sort of rebut my own co-panelist Scrum.
It's about time.
There's been a lot of references to Scrum has changed, or the Scrum Guide. I do want to mention that Scrum.org, which is basically Ken Schwaber,
and 100 trainers around the world,
as the dictator of his version of Scrum, has written his version of the Scrum Guide. I know plenty of people that have been around doing this as long as Ken Schwaber who disagree with some of those things, like removing the word commitment, for example. So I just want to say that the Scrum.org Scrum Guide is one view, basically Ken Schwaber's view of what Scrum should be, and there are other opinions on that.
Yeah, and in the Agile Atlas also, hadn't it kind of be reworded to soften that a little bit too, to say we're committing to trying hard to get things done, but we're not necessarily committing that X will be done in 2 weeks. Right? I thought the Agile Atlas had kind of, which is the new body of knowledge over the Scrum Alliance.
Ultimately, the evolution of Scrum happening in the real world.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
how
you feel about commitment or what it means is a function of what dysfunction you were trying to fix in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? I was at a customer today that has a culture of distrust. And so I'm like, great, you guys need to make me some commitments for a while. And that's going to feel weird, but that's going to fix a lot in the culture. And then we'll talk about getting into forecasting.
So commitment is still a Scrum value, don't get me wrong, but in terms of committing to what you're going to get done in 2 weeks, it's changed a little bit on the Scrum.org side. I thought it had changed in the Scrum Alliance too, but those are stupid methodology wars and stuff you don't care about, right? So let's get back to the nature of your real question. How do I get predictability and know when some things are going to be done? And here's the answer, and it works for both of these methods. Gather and measure data over time, and this law of averages, and then use it to forecast when these things get. But realize, even with the best forecasting, even with a team that has been together for like 3 years, there is an amount of complexity in software development that you cannot foresee. And if you ignore that fact, you might be ignoring a wonderful business opportunity to take advantage of. And while you're focused on the 3,000 hours with the 1,000 hours, a business opportunity might have arose that you could have taken advantage of. And you're like, well, we're not done with our 3,000 hour project yet. No, forget that. Pivot to make some money, right? Deliver some business value. So the short answer is, over time, both of these methods have a way of sort of leveling it out to give you much better predictability, much better than the old ways. So, and that's one thing I'll say positive about Kanban. It's good with the metrics.
What if, I see a hand, at least one hand or two hands going up.
Some.
And so I want to honor our panel and our attendees by just a round of thanks for